Hey, cool Gray. Today we're going to do something in my kitchen that hasn't been done before. Well, not on video anyway. I'm going to make a recipe I've never tried before. I'm going to experiment, I'm going to follow the instructions, and I'm going to take you along on the journey with me. This, oh my gosh, is Alton Brown's butternut squash bread recipe. Just feast your eyes on that for a moment. Alton says this was originally supposed to be a pumpkin bread recipe, but he was making it at a time of year when fresh pumpkin was not readily available, so he substituted butternut squash and it came out better. In his words, way better. And he told me personally, okay, not so personally, on Facebook, to just make this. So I did. I set the camera going as I went through all of the steps of this recipe, and I'm gonna do a voiceover to tell you what was going on in the video at the time that each step was happening. If I do this again, there are a few things I'll do in advance. I will shred the butternut squash ahead of time, and I will toast the pumpkin seeds ahead of time, and I will have things kind of going a little more smoothly. But because the point of this video is that I'm making it for the first time and I'm inviting you along on the ride with me, I'm just going to show you all the flubs and mistakes and just fun things that happen in the kitchen while I'm making this. So it does take some effort to make this. It's not as easy as just throwing together a quick pumpkin bread with a can of pureed pumpkin, but you know what? Anybody you serve this to will thank you for the extra effort. Come on, let's go. So whenever I make a recipe for the first time, I scotch tape it to my cabinet so that it doesn't get full of all of my ingredients and so that I can read it easily. It's at eye level. I am going to double this recipe because I had enough butternut squash to make 2 loaves and I'd like to give one to my parents. So my butternut squash is a 4-pounder, which will yield me a little under 3 pounds of chunks, which is a little more than I need. I've got my baking powder, baking soda, and kosher salt. I've got cinnamon, and I'm going to use a little bit more cinnamon than the recipe calls for because that is my way. I always do. Because I'm doubling my recipe, I've got 6 eggs ready to go, and I've got some pure vanilla extract. The recipe calls for some vegetable oil. And then I'm going to have to weigh my dry ingredients. So I've got some raw pumpkin seeds, some sugar, and some all-purpose flour, some bowls ready, and my kitchen scale. Your equipment, you're going to need a food processor, one with a shredding blade as well as a mixing blade, and you're going to need a kitchen scale, because the recipe does say that you need to weigh your ingredients. It's not given in cup measurements. So here are my 2 pans. I'm just going to go ahead and quickly prepare them because they are stick pans and not non-stick pans. I'm going to have to grease and flour. I'm using just an oil spray that is butter flavored and just a little bit of flour in the pan. And what I typically do when I'm preparing my pans is I put a little bit of flour in one and go ahead and pat it all around evenly and then take the excess and dump it into the second pan, and that keeps the waste down to a minimum and gives me a beautifully floured pan. And then I'm just going to go ahead and set those aside for later and get started on my batter. Now I'm going to measure out my dry ingredients. These are raw pumpkin seeds I buy in bulk from the Whole Foods or Earth Fare type stores. I'm going to go ahead and measure out what the recipe calls for. I've got a piece of baking parchment on top so that when I'm finished I can just lift it off and easily put it into my container and set those aside for toasting a little bit later. Then when I'm ready to do my sugar and flour, I'm going to use the tare feature. It's a little dial that will allow me to bring my scale back to 0 with the weight of the receptacle sitting on top, and then I'll go ahead and measure out my sugar for 12 ounces doubled, so that's 24 ounces. Now I'm ready to do the very same thing with the flour, and in this case I need 20 ounces of flour, which is barely going to fit in this cup, but I'm going to put it immediately into my food processor, so I'm a risk taker by nature. And as you watch this video, you will learn that for yourself. Yeah, that works. All right, into the food processor with the dry ingredients. We're going to just give those a little bit of a spin. So the flour is going in, not the sugar. And then I'm going to add my baking soda, baking powder, and salt. I'm going to go ahead and put the cinnamon in there. Take those for a little spin. Now you could do this in a stand mixer, and you could do it by hand, but you're going to be using this food processor for a few things. So this is the way to keep the number of items that you need to clean later down, and it's most efficient. My countertop got pretty busy, so I was grateful to just have the one food processor going. I'm going to go ahead and put that in my giant bowl. Don't tell Alton, but this is actually a Bobby Flay bowl. It's huge, and because when I do holiday baking, I usually double and triple recipes, it's really one of the favorite things that I have in my kitchen. I'm going to replace this blade because right now I'm going to go ahead and make the rest of the batter so I can get right back to work with the sugar, and I'm going to add the oil. I've got my 6 eggs and my vanilla extract. And I'm just going to pulse those items a few times until they are blended. And once that's done, I'm going to add that to my dry ingredients, give them a little bit of a stir to combine, and that's my basic batter. I can just put that aside for later. So I'm going to multitask now. In just about a tablespoon of oil, I'm going to toast my raw pumpkin seeds on a fairly high heat. It's medium high. You're going to have to watch these carefully. They'll take maybe 5 minutes to really get going, but the stirring is one of the important things for getting an even toast all around. You want to take care not to burn them. And while those are doing that, I'm going to start cutting up my butternut squash, which I'll then need to shred. And every time I get to a logical stopping point, I'm going to come back over and check my pumpkin seeds, keeping a close eye on them. You can see that there's a little bit of browning, but there's still a great deal of green there, so I'm not quite done yet, but I do want to continue to stir. Otherwise, you'll end up with a very uneven brown and some not brown at all. And then I'll come back and continue to cut up my butternut squash. Now I need 2 pounds for this recipe since I'm doubling my loaf. I've got my scale here again ready to measure that out. And as I said, it was a 4-pound butternut squash, and I got about 3 pounds of chunks out of this. So when you're selecting your butternut squash, if you're just making a single recipe, you'll probably need a 1.5 to 2 pound squash to get the chunks that you need. Now my seeds are browning very, very nicely. They are almost done. I'm reducing the heat a little bit so that I don't get a burn at this point. They'll go pretty quickly, so I'm going to watch a little bit more closely while I finish up my squash chunks. And I wish video technology included the ability for you to smell those pumpkin seeds as they're toasting. It's amazing. All right, looks like we are ready. That's a great level of doneness. Perfect. So I'm going to take them off the heat. You can see there are a couple here that are still green, but they actually are toasted, and a couple that are darker. That's just perfect. Now I typically salt them, but the recipe does not call for that, so I'm just going to go ahead and drain them on a paper towel to get the oil out. And now I'm going to come over and begin shredding my butternut squash. I've put the shredding attachment onto my food processor, and I'm just going to go ahead and feed those chunks into the chute until I have them all shredded. Now my food processor does a great job of shredding, but one thing it does not do a good job of is keeping these little chunks of unshredded stuff out of my beautiful shred. So as I empty this onto a very clean kitchen towel, as the recipe calls for, you'll see that I'm going to end up having to pick out a bunch of large chunks. So I would say the next time I make this recipe, I may shred up a little bit more butternut squash than the weight, because it looks to me like I had to take about an ounce of big chunks out of there. My food processor is beautiful and red and shiny like a fire engine, but it's unnecessarily complicated. So I'm just going to pull those out of there. Now the reason I'm putting these on a towel is because the recipe says I'm supposed to roll it all up into a ball and squeeze out any moisture. It looks to me like this step was probably meant for the original pumpkin bread, because there was really no moisture whatsoever in here. So I'm following the instructions. I'm going to roll it all up into a beautiful ball. I'm going to take it over to my sink like a good girl, and I'm going to twist and drain, and I'm going to get virtually no moisture out of this whatsoever. So I think you can safely skip this step. And once that's done, I'm just going to add it directly into my batter. So you could probably go from food processor right into batter. And once I've got that in there, I'm going to add my toasted pumpkin seeds. It's probably a good idea to make sure those are somewhat cooled before adding them to this batter. So that's another reason I'll do them ahead of time next time. Now, if you've watched any of my recipe videos before, you'll know that this spatula stuff just does not cut it for me. And Alton specifically says in the recipe that I can use my hands, so I'm getting in there with my hands. I've said it before, I will say it again. If you're not getting your hands into your food, you're doing it wrong. This, I think, adds a level of intimacy, and I know I'm laughing when I say that, but honestly, there's something really satisfying about getting that close to the ingredients. Call me crazy. Go ahead, do it. You know you want to, because it's about to get crazier. Since my hand is already full of batter, why dirty a spoon? I'm just going to go ahead and measure half that batter right into this pan with my hands. It works really well. You can see how thick and gooey it is, very much like a carrot cake. It doesn't taste as overbearing as a carrot cake when we're done. Now I'm going to go ahead and pop both my loaves into a 325-degree oven, and they're going to bake for about an hour and 15 minutes. The other piece of kitchen equipment you're going to want for this recipe is a thermometer, a food thermometer, because we want an internal temperature of 200 to 210. So you'll see I've got it just about right. It took about an hour, almost an hour and a half to achieve that. And now I'm going to let them cool in these beautiful pans for a little while before I turn them out onto a rack to cool completely. You have no idea how difficult it was to let these cool before tasting them. The smell was amazing. I'm glad that we used the thermometer technique to test for doneness, because as you can see, these don't get deep golden brown, and I was wondering if they were actually done. So enjoy that gorgeous look. And now we're ready to taste. Okay, so our butternut squash bread is ready. We've warmed up a couple of nice thick slices and topped it with some cream cheese. And if you're going to do that, seriously, don't be shy. This is a New York schmear right here. So we're going to taste it. I got Mr. Cool Gray with me. Let's have a bite.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, so good. What jumps out at you?
Well, you have to eat it warm. That really makes a difference.
Warm? The little extra cinnamon that I put in really pops. And that's always a good thing.
Yeah.
The toasted pumpkin seeds are crunchy, and they add a little additional flavor. That's fantastic. And cream cheese is the perfect counterpart.
Yeah.
Well, Alton was right. This is crazy delicious. And I cannot imagine that pumpkin would be better. Thanks so much for joining us today for this recipe. If you make it, please let me know. You can let Alton know too. I'm going to link to the recipe in the description box. While you're letting me know and while you're clicking around and doing things, would you please like this video? If you did, consider subscribing. Check out a few more videos. We've got lots of recipes if you're a cooking enthusiast. And we will see you again next time.